In 1961, a widow in Rotherham fed herself for an entire week on 4 shillings and sixpence, 1 pot, 1 ring, the same chipped enamel pan her mother had used before her. She never once went to bed hungry. Number 7 kept Lancashire mill towns fed through 2 world wars. Number 13 costs less than £2 and feeds you for 4 days. Number 1 has been feeding the British working class for 300 years, and most people under 60 have forgotten it exists. Number 25, mushy pea and potato pot. When the cupboard had almost nothing left, it usually still had dried peas and a potato or two. That was enough. You soaked the peas overnight, drained them, and put them in a pot with diced potato, water, salt, and a knob of whatever fat you had. An hour of simmering, and the peas collapsed into a thick khaki-colored mash that absorbed the potato and thickened the broth into something almost solid. It was not pretty. Nobody ever claimed it was pretty, but it was warm, it was filling, and it cost almost nothing. In pit villages across Yorkshire and Derbyshire, this was the pot that appeared on the stove on a Thursday, the day before payday, when everything else had already been eaten. Seniors who had grown up eating it never stopped making it. The body remembers what kept it going. Dot thought this was a good meal? Wait for the next one. Number 24, gammon and cabbage pot. A small piece of gammon, the cheapest cut at the butcher, went into a pot of cold water with a halved onion and came slowly to a boil. The water was changed once to draw out some of the salt, then a half head of cabbage was added, and everything simmered together for 90 minutes. The gammon gave the broth a deep, smoky sweetness. The cabbage softened into silky folds that soaked up every trace of that flavor. One small piece of gammon fed a person for 3 days. The pot on day 2 tasted better than the pot on day 1. In Irish communities in Manchester and Liverpool, this was the boiled dinner that kept families fed through the worst weeks of winter. A senior with 1 pot, 1 ring, and a piece of gammon had everything they needed. Surprised by this meal? You won't believe meal number 1. Number 23, kedgeree. This was the meal that proved cheap food did not have to be sad food. A cup of rice cooked in lightly salted water, a piece of smoked haddock poached in milk, a hard-boiled egg, a pinch of curry powder, and a knob of butter stirred through at the end. The rice absorbed the faint spice, the fish flaked into golden pieces, the egg added richness. The whole thing came together in one small saucepan in under 30 minutes. Smoked haddock was among the least expensive fish at any fishmonger, and the curry powder, just a quarter teaspoon, transformed plain rice and fish into something fragrant and satisfying. Fishermen's families in Aberdeen and Hull had been eating versions of this for 100 years. For a senior cooking alone, a single portion cost less than 70 pence and tasted like you had made an effort. Number 22, turnip and carrot stew. 2 carrots, 1 medium turnip, an onion, a stock cube, water. That was the whole recipe. And it produced a stew that was sweeter and more satisfying than its ingredients had any right to suggest. The turnip and carrot were the vegetables that never went out of season, never ran out, and never cost much. You diced everything rough, dropped it into a pot, covered it with water, crumbled in the stock cube, and left it to simmer for 40 minutes. At the end, you could mash it coarsely right in the pot to thicken the broth. A slice of bread on the side, and it was a proper meal. In Scottish working-class kitchens, this was called a bash, a rough mash of whatever roots were cheapest that week. Seniors who had made it for decades made it without measuring anything, entirely by instinct and feel. Number 21, savory rice pot. A cup of rice, 1 onion diced, 1 carrot diced, a stock cube, water, and whatever was left at the bottom of the fridge. That was the principle. You fried the onion briefly in a little fat, added the rice and carrot, poured in twice the volume of stock, covered the pot, and let it absorb everything for 18 minutes. The result was somewhere between a pilaf and a thick soup. It took on the flavor of whatever scraps you added, which meant no 2 pots ever tasted identical. Leftover peas went in. A spoonful of tomato puree went in. A strip of bacon, diced small, went in. The genius was that the meal existed to use what was already there, which meant almost nothing was ever wasted. For a senior on a fixed income, food waste was not a minor inconvenience. It was money thrown directly in the bin. Number 20. Hot pot. Lancashire hot pot was never a restaurant dish. It was a working family's answer to the question of how you feed several people on very little meat without anyone leaving the table hungry. For a senior cooking alone, the proportions shrank, but the principle remained identical. A small amount of cheapest neck of lamb or mutton, sliced onion, a little carrot, seasoning, enough water or stock to barely cover, and a tight layer of sliced potato across the top. The pot went into a low oven and stayed there for 2 hours. The potato layer absorbed the steam and turned golden on top while softening into the broth beneath. In Wigan, Burnley, and Bolton, hot pot was eaten every week for generations. A single small pot fed one person for 3 days. You simply reheated it and ate it again, and it was better each time. Here is what most conversations about elderly people and food get completely wrong. They focus on nutrition. They talk about vitamins and protein ratios and caloric intake, as if the problem is that seniors do not know that vegetables are good for them. The actual problem is simpler and harder to solve. Cooking for one person feels pointless. The portions are small. Washing up seems disproportionate to the meal. The kitchen is too quiet. The chair opposite is empty, and the voice that used to say that smells good is not there anymore. The meals on this list were never just cheap, they were survivable. You could make them tired. You could make them with stiff hands and a bad back, and a kitchen that had not been properly scrubbed in a fortnight. They asked almost nothing and gave back warmth and a full stomach, which is sometimes all that stands between a person and a very bad evening. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. Number 19, bread pudding. When the bread had gone stale and throwing it away felt wrong, which in certain kitchens it always did, it became bread pudding. You tore the stale bread into chunks, soaked it in warm milk until soft, squeezed out the excess, then mixed it with sugar, a beaten egg, a handful of dried fruit, and a pinch of spice. It went into a greased pot or baking dish and baked slowly until set and golden on top. The result was dense, sweet, and filling in the way that very few things costing so little managed to be. It kept for days. It was eaten cold as a snack and warm as a meal. In East London and in the Midlands, street market stalls sold bread pudding by the square for tuppence well into the 1970s. For a senior alone, it solved 2 problems at once. It used up bread that would otherwise be wasted, and it provided something sweet to eat at the end of a day that had offered very little else. Number 18, rice pudding supper. Rice, milk, sugar, and thyme. That was all. You put a handful of pudding rice into a pot with enough full-fat milk to cover it generously, added a spoonful of sugar and a scraping of nutmeg if you had any, and left it on the very lowest heat for an hour and a half, stirring every 20 minutes. The rice swelled slowly, and the milk thickened around it into a pale, creamy porridge that was sweet and gentle and entirely filling. In the 1940s and 1950s, rice pudding was eaten as a main course in thousands of British households when the budget had run out before the week had. It was not a treat or a dessert, it was supper. For a senior with dental problems, it was perfect, no chewing required, soft, warm, and cheap enough that even the worst week of the month could not put it out of reach. Number 17, fish pie pot. A proper fish pie with a pastry crust was a Sunday dish, a special occasion dish. The fish pie pot was something else entirely. A tin of fish, most often pilchards or coulis, was flaked into a pot with diced boiled potato, a simple white sauce made from milk, and a little flour, salt, and pepper. Everything was stirred together and heated through until the sauce bubbled. It was not elegant. It asked nothing of you technically, but it was warm, it was filling, and it tasted like proper food rather than a compromise. Tinned coulis and pilchards were among the cheapest proteins available at any corner shop, and they kept on shelves for months. For a senior who got to the shops only once a week or less, tinned fish was the pantry staple that stood between them and an empty plate. Number 16, suet dumpling stew. The dumpling was the genius of English poverty cooking. When you had a small amount of meat and a few vegetables but not quite enough to fill a bowl properly, you made dumplings. 2 tablespoons of self-raising flour, 1 tablespoon of suet, a pinch of salt, and just enough water to bring it together. Rolled into small balls and dropped into a simmering pot, they doubled in size within 20 minutes, absorbing the flavor of whatever broth surrounded them. A thin stew became a substantial meal. The dumplings were the filler, the ballast, the thing that meant nobody went to bed still hungry. For a senior stretching a small piece of braising steak or a couple of pork ribs across several days, dumplings turned a bowl of thin broth into something that held you until morning. Number 15, tripe and onion stew. This is the one that will divide opinion, but it deserves its place on this list. Tripe was for decades the cheapest meat available at any butcher in the industrial north of England, and it was eaten without apology in Manchester, Bradford, Leeds, and Preston. The preparation was simple. Dressed tripe, already cleaned and parboiled by the butcher, went into a pot with sliced onions, milk, water, salt, and pepper. It simmered gently for an hour until the tripe turned tender and the liquid thickened into a pale, savory gravy. The flavor was mild, almost neutral, which meant it took on the sweetness of the onion and the richness of the milk. Seniors who had grown up eating it continued to make it into very old age. The total cost of a full pot rarely exceeded 50 pence. The tripe shops of northern England may have almost disappeared, but the tradition they fed belongs on this list. Number 14, parsnip and potato soup. This was the winter soup that cost almost nothing and tasted like something a good restaurant would charge handsomely for. 2 parsnips, peeled and diced, 2 potatoes, peeled and cubed, 1 onion, a stock cube, and water to cover. You put it all in a pot, brought it to a boil, and simmered it for 30 minutes until everything was completely soft. Then you mashed it roughly with a fork, right in the pot, so the soup stayed chunky but thickened to a creamy consistency. No blender required, no cream required. The parsnip provided natural sweetness and body. The potato gave it substance. In rural England and in Welsh valleys, parsnips were grown in almost every kitchen garden well into the post-war period, because they survived the frost and needed almost no tending. For a senior cooking in January with very little money, a pot of parsnip and potato soup was warmth you could feel from the inside. Number 13, split pea and ham hock pot. Nothing was wasted in a kitchen that understood hunger. When the gammon had been eaten, the ham hock that cost less than £1 at the butcher or supermarket went straight into a pot with a cup of split yellow peas, a sliced onion, and enough water to cover everything by 2 inches. It simmered for 3 hours on the lowest heat. The peas dissolved completely. The hock surrendered every trace of smoky, salty richness it held. What remained was a thick golden soup so dense it could almost be eaten with a fork. In Yorkshire, this was what district nurses of the 1960s recommended specifically to elderly patients living alone, because it kept in the refrigerator for 5 days, provided complete protein, and required almost no effort to reheat. The hock was free in the sense that it was already paid for as part of Sunday's dinner. This was arithmetic, and the arithmetic worked. Here is something that food writers almost never say out loud. The ingredients that kept elderly British people alive and independent for the better part of a century are precisely the ingredients that no one can make money selling you. Split peas, parsnips, pearl barley, dripping, suet, oats, stale bread. There is no advertising budget behind a bag of dried peas. There is no celebrity face on a turnip. The profit margin on a ham hock is pennies. These are the foods that supermarkets relegate to the bottom shelf, the foods that food media ignores because no sponsored post was ever built around a pot of barley broth. Meanwhile, ready meals marketed specifically to elderly people eating alone cost £3.50 and contain less actual nutrition than a bowl of lentil soup that costs 20 pence. That is not an accident of the market. That is the market working exactly as intended. Number 12. Stargazy-style fish pot. Along the coast of Cornwall and Devon, fishing communities had always understood that the cheapest fish made the best soup. This simplified one-pot version took cheap white fish, most often coley, pollock, or whiting, and placed it in a pot with diced potato, sliced onion, water, salt, and a scraping of butter. The fish poached gently in the liquid for 20 minutes, flaking apart into the broth and turning the potato starchy and soft. It was finished with a splash of milk and a crack of black pepper. The result was thin but deeply flavored, the kind of soup that tasted of sea air and warmth and something older than restaurants. Coley in particular was often given away cheaply because it turned gray when cooked, which put off shoppers but made absolutely no difference to the taste. For a senior who knew this, coley was the best-kept secret at the fishmonger's counter. Number 11. Cabbage soup. A whole head of cabbage cost next to nothing. You quartered it, roughly chopped it, and dropped it into a pot with a sliced onion, a stock cube, water, salt, and a little pepper. 30 minutes of simmering, and the cabbage turned sweet and soft, releasing its flavor into a broth that was thin but satisfying and deeply warming. It was the meal that said, "The cupboard is almost empty, and I'm still going to eat tonight." Polish and Ukrainian families who had settled in the mining communities of South Wales and the Midlands brought versions of this recipe with them. It crossed every cultural line because poverty crosses every cultural line. For a senior who needed something hot in their stomach and had very little to spend, cabbage soup required nothing more than a pot, a ring, and about 12 minutes of standing. Number 10. Mutton and root veg pot. Before lamb replaced it in British butcher shops, mutton was the working person's meat. Tougher, stronger in flavor, and significantly cheaper. It demanded only one thing that most people in a hurry were not willing to give it: time. A small piece of scrag end or neck of mutton went into a pot with diced carrot, turnip, and potato, an onion, water, salt, and a sprig of thyme. It simmered for 2.5 hours on the lowest possible heat. Given that time, the mutton fell apart entirely, releasing a depth of flavor into the broth that younger, more expensive lamb could not match. For a senior with patience and a low gas ring, this was the meal that turned a very cheap cut into something that tasted expensive. The whole pot cost under £1 and fed one person for 4 days. Number 9. Oatmeal porridge supper. This is the entry that will surprise most people because porridge is breakfast food. Everyone knows that, except that for a large part of British history, it was not. Savory oatmeal porridge was eaten as an evening meal across Scotland, the north of England, and rural Wales for centuries, and it continued to appear on the tables of elderly people well into the 1970s. You made it exactly as you would make breakfast porridge, with rolled oats, water, and a pinch of salt, but you added a crumbled stock cube, a little pepper, and sometimes a spoonful of dripping stirred through at the end. The result was thick, hot, and deeply filling. A bowl of savory oat porridge cost less than 10 pence and kept a person satisfied until the following morning. For a senior who could barely stand and had almost nothing in the house, this was the meal that asked the very least and still delivered warmth and substance. Number 8. Bubble and squeak stew. The original bubble and squeak was a fried leftover dish made in a pan with cold mashed potato and cooked cabbage pressed into a cake. The stew version was what you made when you had the same ingredients but less energy. Leftover or fresh potato and cabbage went into a pot with a little stock or water, salt, and whatever fat was to hand. Everything simmered together until the potato began to break apart and thicken the liquid into something between a broth and a mash. Some people added a little mustard. Some added a spoonful of Worcestershire sauce. The flavor was mild and savory and entirely comforting. For a senior who needed to eat but could not stand over a frying pan managing the heat and the turning, the stew version of this dish was the version that was actually manageable. Accessibility mattered more than authenticity, and the taste was just as good. Number 7. Scouse. In Liverpool, scouse was not a recipe. It was a way of life. The word itself came from lobscouse, a sailor's stew brought into port by Norwegian and Scandinavian merchants, and it was adopted so completely by Liverpool's working communities that it gave the city its nickname. The principle was simple: cheap meat, usually neck of lamb or beef skirt, potatoes, onion, carrot, and water. Everything went into one pot and cooked slowly for 2 or more hours until the meat was falling apart and the potato had dissolved into the broth, thickening it into a dense mahogany-colored stew. On the very worst weeks, there was no meat at all, only vegetables, and it was called blind scouse. A widow in the Toxteth area of Liverpool made scouse every Monday for 50 years after her husband died. Her neighbor said the smell of it coming under the front door told you everything was still all right. Number 6. Savoy cabbage and bacon pot. 1 rasher of bacon. That was all it took to transform a pot of boiled cabbage and potato from something plain into something that tasted like dinner. You cut the rasher into small pieces and fried it briefly in the bottom of the pot until the fat ran. Then the cabbage and diced potato went in with a cup of water and a pinch of salt, and everything simmered together for 30 minutes. The bacon fat perfumed the whole pot. The cabbage turned sweet and silky. The potato softened and thickened the liquid. 1 rasher stretched across an entire pot of food, which was the point. The art of poverty cooking was always the art of making a small amount of flavor do the work of a large amount of meat. Savoy cabbage was among the cheapest and most forgiving of vegetables. It improved with slow cooking in a way that more delicate greens never could. Number 5. Potato and cabbage pot. Without even the bacon. Just potato, cabbage, water, salt, and a knob of butter added at the end if you had any. This was the meal that appeared in the very final days of a very tight week, when everything else had been used up and these 2 things were all that remained. The potatoes were cut into rough chunks and simmered with the cabbage until both were tender and the liquid had taken on a faint sweetness from the vegetables. Some of the potato was mashed directly into the pot with a fork to thicken everything. You ate it in a bowl with bread if there was any. It was the Irish dish called coal cannon, stripped of its butter and cream and reduced to its plainest, cheapest form. And yet it was filling, and yet it was warm, and yet it cost almost nothing. That was the entirety of what was required. Number 4. Pea soup. A bag of split peas, dried and green or yellow, cost almost nothing and lasted for months on a shelf. You did not need to soak them overnight. You rinsed them, added them to a pot with a sliced onion, cold water, and salt. Brought everything slowly to a boil, and then let it all simmer uncovered for 40 minutes, stirring occasionally as the peas collapsed and the liquid turned thick and pale green and intensely savory. A ham bone or a small piece of bacon improved it enormously, but it stood perfectly on its own without. The soup thickened further as it cooled, so the pot made on Sunday fed a person through to Wednesday without a second thought. In British Army mess halls, naval canteens, and school cafeterias, pea soup appeared every week for decades because it cost almost nothing to make in bulk and left nobody hungry. For a senior cooking alone, the same economy applied. Number 3. Barley broth. Pearl barley was the forgotten grain that belonged on every elderly person's shelf. Unlike rice, which cooks in 15 minutes and gives back nothing to the liquid around it, barley swelled slowly and released starch into the pot, thickening whatever broth it sat in into something dense and deeply sustaining. You put a handful of pearl barley into a pot with whatever vegetables were available, most often carrot, onion, and a small piece of turnip, covered everything with water or a light stock, and left it to simmer for an hour. The barley tripled in size. The broth turned thick and creamy. The vegetables softened into the pot and became part of something greater than their individual cost. The 1958 National Food Survey recorded that pensioners who had grown up during the First World War still bought barley regularly when most of the population had abandoned it. They knew something the rest of the country had forgotten. Number 2. Bread and dripping stew. Dripping was the fat that collected in the bottom of the roasting tin after a joint of meat. It was never thrown away. It set into a pale, savory jelly that was kept in a basin in the larder and used all week for frying, for spreading on bread, and when the week grew very thin, for making the meal that sat at number 2 on this list. You melted a spoonful of dripping in a pot, added a sliced onion and let it soften, then poured in hot stock, crumbled a piece of stale bread into the liquid, and let everything simmer until the bread had dissolved entirely and the broth was thick with it. The result was something between a soup and a porridge, dark and savory and intensely warming. It asked almost nothing of anyone. In the 1940s, when rationing was at its tightest, this was the meal that kept people going on the hardest days. The dripping was free, the bread was already there. The stock came from a cube or from whatever bones had been in the pot the week before. Number 1. Lentil and onion stew. A cup of dried red lentils. 1 onion, sliced. A stock cube. Water. Salt. That was the whole recipe. You fried the onion in a little oil or fat until it softened and turned golden at the edges, then added the lentils, covered everything with water, crumbled in the stock cube, and simmered for 25 minutes. Red lentils did not need soaking. They dissolved completely, turning the broth thick and orange gold and earthy with a depth of flavor that seemed impossible from 4 ingredients. A bag of red lentils cost less than £1 and made 8 full bowls of stew. It kept in the refrigerator for 5 days. It froze without losing anything. It reheated in 3 minutes. District nurses across the north of England recommended this specific pot to elderly patients throughout the 1960s because the iron, protein, and fiber it provided were better than most of what was available from more expensive sources. The widow in Salford, who is at the beginning of this video, made lentil and onion stew 3 nights a week for 9 years. Her doctor said her blood work was better than women half her age. She said it was just what her mother had taught her. 1 pot, 1 burner, 1 bowl. That was enough. Share in the comments which one you are going to make. If this was useful for you, hit subscribe. These meals are still here. They have been waiting. Now you know where to find them.